The spilled wine didn't end the evening at the Golden Lamb. The silence that followed did. Everyone in Chicago's underworld understood one unspoken rule. You did not exist at Elliot Riley's table. You materialized, you poured, you disappeared. The girl who just clipped his glass had committed a sin far worse than clumsiness. She'd made herself real in front of him. He didn't raise his voice. Men like Elliot Riley never needed to. He leaned back in his chair, slow and deliberate, the way a lion settles before it's finished deciding whether to bother. Then he opened his mouth and did something no one in that room expected. He spoke Russian, not conversational Russian, not tourist Russian, the clipped, aristocratic dialect of old Moscow money, the kind that only circulated in rooms ordinary people were never allowed to enter. Words designed to strip a person down to bone and leave them grateful for the mercy of still breathing. He thought it was a locked room, a private cruelty with no witnesses. She straightened her spine, looked him dead in the eye, and unlocked the door from the other side. The 7 words she replied with weren't loud. They didn't have to be. They landed in the room like a blade finding the gap between ribs, precise, quiet, and absolutely fatal to the moment he thought he controlled. The jazz trio at the back corner stopped playing, not because they were told to, because the room itself seemed to stop. If you're listening right now, help me prove something wrong. My mother said I wouldn't even reach 5,000 subscribers, but I believe stories like this, stories about women who hide in plain sight until the moment they can't anymore, deserve to be heard. Help me show her that these tales matter. Hit subscribe and let's find out who this waitress really is. The Golden Lamb kept its temperature at a controlled 66 degrees year-round, cold enough to keep the crystals sweating, warm enough to keep the clients comfortable. Alicia Woods had learned that in her first week. She'd cataloged it the same way she cataloged everything about this place, quietly, completely, and without ever letting anyone notice she was paying attention. That was the skill. That had always been the skill. She was 27 years old and had been invisible for 3 of them. Before Chicago, she had been something else entirely, something she'd buried under a new social security number, a Midwestern accent she'd practiced until it stopped feeling like a costume, and a server's apron that was the most effective disguise she'd ever worn. In a former life, she had sat in rooms not unlike this one, translating the private architecture of powerful men's words for people whose names never appeared on any document. She had learned that language was never just language. It was a blueprint, a confession, a loaded weapon pointed at whoever was listening. She had stopped listening. She had chosen to stop. Table 7 needed water. Table 3 was ready for the dessert menu. The man at table 1, that table, the one anchoring the room's entire gravitational field, was named Elliot Riley, and she had been studiously not looking at him for the better part of 4 hours. She knew who he was before his reservation appeared on the books. Everyone in Chicago with functioning survival instincts knew who Elliot Riley was. He wasn't dangerous the way loud men were dangerous, with noise and spectacle and rage that announced itself before it arrived. He was dangerous the way deep water was dangerous, utterly still on the surface, the kind of still that meant something massive was moving underneath. He was wearing a black shirt, open at the collar, rolled once at the sleeve, deliberate casualness that somehow read as more menacing than a tailored suit. Tattoos mapped across his forearms in dark ink, not decorative, not reckless, but worn the way a soldier wore his history. His watch alone cost more than 3 months of her rent. He wore it like he'd forgotten it was there. She had been careful, 4 hours of careful. Then his second-in-command, Vance, had gestured for the table's wine to be refilled, a sharp, impatient flick of the wrist that telegraphed his opinion of the person doing the refilling, and Elliot had shifted suddenly in his chair, turning back from the man across from him, and the bottle had caught the glass at precisely the wrong angle. Red wine bloomed across the white tablecloth like something catastrophic. A single dark drop landed on the back of Elliot Riley's hand. The room understood what that meant before Alicia did. She watched him look down at it. She watched something cold move behind his eyes. She kept her own face neutral, professional, already reaching for the folded service cloth at her waist, already forming the words of an apology calibrated to be brief and invisible. She never got to say them. Because Elliot Riley turned to look at her for the first time all evening. Really look, the kind of look that took inventory. And then, in a language she had not heard spoken aloud in 3 years, he told her precisely what he thought of girls like her, and what happened to things that outlived their usefulness. The Russian was flawless, old world, the dialect of men who had never once in their lives needed to raise their voice to be obeyed. He thought he was speaking into a void. Alicia set the bottle down on the table, slowly, deliberately. When she looked up, she wasn't the girl who served the drinks anymore. She replied in the same dialect, cleaner, if anything, sharper at the edges, and what she said made the color shift almost imperceptibly in Elliot Riley's face. Not embarrassment, not quite, something more dangerous than that. The sudden, recalibrating awareness of a man who has just realized the room he thought was empty has been occupied this entire time. The jazz trio had stopped playing. Vance's hand froze around his glass. Across the table, the rival lieutenant who'd been negotiating quietly with Elliot for the last 4 hours went very, very still. Because Alicia's 7 words hadn't just answered Elliot Riley. They had quoted him back to himself, verbatim, from a conversation he'd been having in Russian for the last 4 hours, in a room full of people he was certain couldn't understand a word. Elliot Riley did not look away from her. "Sit down," he said, in English this time. It wasn't an invitation. Alicia Woods owned 4 things worth counting: a studio apartment on Halstead with a deadbolt she'd installed herself, a prepaid phone she replaced every 90 days, a leather notebook filled with vocabulary drills in 7 languages she never spoke aloud, and the particular skill of becoming furniture. That last one had kept her alive. The Golden Lamb was easy work as far as easy went. The clientele tipped well because tipping well was part of the performance. It signaled that money was something that happened to them rather than something they chased. The hours were long but predictable. The uniform was anonymous: white shirt, dark apron, hair back. She had worn variations of this costume in 4 cities before Chicago, and she'd learned that people looked through a server the same way they looked through a window, registering only what was on the other side, never the glass itself. She had built her entire life around being the glass. It wasn't difficult. She'd been trained by people far more exacting than a Chicago restaurant manager. In another life, in rooms with no windows and documents with no signatures, she had been taught that the most valuable person in any negotiation was the one nobody noticed was listening. Her former employer, a man whose name she no longer allowed herself to think in full, had understood that intelligence wasn't gathered through force. It was harvested through patience, through stillness, through the precise cultivation of invisibility. She had learned too well. She had learned, eventually, that invisibility was the only thing keeping her breathing. So she poured wine. She cleared plates. She smiled the specific smile that was warm enough to satisfy and blank enough to forget. In the kitchen, between orders, she ran conjugation tables in her head the way other people ran through grocery lists. Mandarin on Mondays, Arabic on Wednesdays, the Slavic dialects she rotated through on the slow Thursday nights when table 1 sat empty and the room felt almost safe. 7 languages. 8 if she counted the one she'd stopped speaking entirely, the silent dialect of a woman who had once mattered in rooms that could get her killed. She kept that one buried deepest. She should have kept it buried tonight. They didn't escort her out through the front. That was the first thing she noticed, that when the man in the dark suit materialized at her elbow 40 seconds after the room had remembered how to breathe, he didn't steer her toward the door. He steered her toward the back corridor, past the kitchen, past the dry storage, to the private room that the Golden Lamb's management pretended didn't exist for anyone who hadn't earned the right to know it did. Alicia had known the room was there since her 2nd week. She had never expected to be inside it. It was smaller than she'd imagined. A single table, 4 chairs, a bottle of water nobody had touched. Elliot Riley was already seated when they brought her in, jacket gone now, forearms resting on the table with the unhurried ease of a man who had never once in his life been made to wait for anything. He'd sent everyone else out, even Vance, especially Vance, she noticed, which told her something she filed away immediately. He looked at her the way she imagined he looked at contracts, like he was reading for the clause that changed everything. "Sit," he said. She sat. For a long moment he said nothing. The silence wasn't uncomfortable for him. He was using it the way skilled interrogators used it, as a surface, to see what a person couldn't stop themselves from filling it with. She knew the technique. She gave him nothing. Something shifted in his expression, almost imperceptible, almost appreciation. "Where did you learn it?" he said finally. Not a question, a demand with a question's punctuation. "The same way anyone learns anything," Alicia said. "Necessity." "That's not an answer." "No," she agreed. "It isn't." He leaned forward then, just slightly, and she understood for the first time what it felt like to be the undivided focus of Elliot Riley's attention. It was not comfortable. It was not meant to be. It was the specific, pressurized weight of a man who had built an empire by understanding people faster than they understood themselves. "The dialect you used," he said quietly, "is spoken by approximately 900 people still living. Most of them are in Moscow. None of them are wearing that apron." Alicia held his gaze. "Then I suppose," she said, "you have a problem." She didn't go home that night. Not because she wasn't allowed to. Elliot Riley hadn't made her a prisoner, at least not in any way she could point to directly. He had simply told her that the calm finality of a man announcing whether that she would be present at a meeting the following evening, 9 o'clock, the private room. He had said it the way people stated facts about the physical world, as though her attendance were already part of the historical record, and this conversation was merely a formality. She had almost argued. She had looked at the set of his jaw and decided against it. The meeting was already in motion when she arrived. 4 men she didn't recognize, one she did. A Russian logistics broker named Dmitry Solovov, who operated out of a shipping office in Bridgeport and whose reputation in certain circles was built entirely on the precision of his word. He was speaking when she entered, his Russian fluid and fast, clearly assuming the room's comprehension ended at the language's surface. Elliot gestured to the chair beside him without looking at her. She sat. She listened. For 20 minutes, the negotiation moved normally. Territory, timing, the dry arithmetic of men dividing risk into acceptable portions. Alicia kept her face neutral and her hands still in her lap, cataloging every word the way she'd been trained, building the full architecture of the conversation beneath its visible frame. Then Solovov said it, a single redirected phrase, buried inside a longer sentence about loading schedules, wrapped in the mundane vocabulary of logistics. In English, his interpreter rendered it as the South Dock, midnight, Thursday. Clean, reasonable, the natural conclusion to everything that had come before it. In Russian, Solovov had said, the South Dock is where we'll be waiting for him. Alicia didn't move, didn't blink. She reached slowly for the glass of water in front of her and, under the pretense of setting it down, let the backs of her fingers graze the back of Elliot's hand once. Barely contact, a signal with no explanation attached. His eyes cut to her sideways. She held his gaze for exactly 1 second and gave the smallest shake of her head. The meeting concluded pleasantly. Elliot agreed to nothing. Afterward, when the room had emptied, he turned to her in the silence and waited. "They weren't offering you a deal," Alicia said. "They were offering you a location." Vance Mercer smiled too much for a man in his position. Alicia had noticed it on the 3rd day, not the smile itself. Men like Vance wore smiles the way they wore cufflinks, as a finishing touch, a signal of controlled surfaces. What she noticed was the timing of it, the way it arrived a half-second too late after Elliot spoke, like a translation with a perceptible delay. The way it didn't reach the upper half of his face when Elliot's back was turned, but snapped into full warmth the instant Elliot looked his way again. She had spent years reading the negative space between what people said and what their bodies couldn't stop confessing. Vance Mercer was fluent in loyalty's performance. He was not fluent in loyalty itself. She said nothing, not yet. She had learned long ago that an accusation without architecture was just noise, and noise got people killed faster than silence did. So she watched. Vance made 3 phone calls she wasn't meant to notice. She noticed because she had positioned herself in the sightline of the hallway mirror during the Golden Lamb's pre-service hour, a habit so old it no longer required conscious thought. Each call lasted under 90 seconds. Each time, he checked the corridor before dialing. Each time, he used a phone she had never seen him use in Elliot's presence. She watched him at the table during Elliot's next meeting, tracking the way his eyes moved, not to the speaker, the way a loyal second's eyes moved, but to the exits, mapping, calculating, the quiet arithmetic of a man who was not planning to be in this room much longer. The detail that confirmed it was small, almost insultingly small. A thread of conversation Vance believed had passed entirely in English, in which he had referenced a delivery schedule using a time code Alicia recognized from Solov's misdirected Russian 3 nights prior. The same time code, the same doc. Vance hadn't been in that meeting. He hadn't needed to be. She sat with the knowledge for a full 24 hours, turning it over, stress-testing every angle, making certain she wasn't building a conclusion from coincidence. She wasn't. The structure was too clean, the threads too deliberately parallel. The threat Elliot was watching for was standing directly behind him. It was past midnight when she found him at the bar. Not performing, for once, not occupying a room the way he usually occupied rooms, with that low gravitational authority that made other men unconsciously reposition themselves. He was simply sitting, a glass of something amber barely touched in front of him, his eyes on the middle distance where the good crystal caught the low light and threw it back in pieces. Alicia had been on her way out. She almost kept walking. She sat down 2 stools away instead. She wasn't entirely sure why. For a while, neither of them said anything, which had become, she realized, one of the stranger comforts of whatever this was. That silence between them didn't require management. It could simply exist. He spoke first, and in Russian, which surprised her. Not the cold, aristocratic weapon he'd reached for that first night, something quieter. The informal register, the language as it sounded inside a home rather than across a negotiating table. He said, "My mother used to say that a person's real character lived in their second language, that you couldn't lie as fluently in a tongue you'd had to earn." Alicia was still for a moment. Then she answered in kind, in the same register. "She sounds like someone worth listening to." She was. A pause. She came from Minsk originally, spent 30 years in Chicago without ever fully releasing the accent. "I used to be embarrassed by it when I was young." Something moved across his face that wasn't quite a smile and wasn't quite grief, but occupied the territory between them. "I spent 4 years learning the language after she died, trying to hear what I'd been too stupid to appreciate when she was alive." Alicia looked at him then, really looked, the way she'd been carefully avoiding since the beginning, because she had understood instinctively that seeing Elliot Riley clearly was a more dangerous proposition than anything else this city had offered her. He wasn't performing now. There was no audience for this version of him, no strategic advantage in its existence. It was simply a man sitting with a loss he hadn't finished carrying. She thought about her own buried languages, her own people she'd left without proper goodbyes. "She would have been proud of your accent," Alicia said softly, in English this time. It felt more honest.
He looked at her like she'd said something that required careful handling. He didn't disagree. If that moment just landed for you, a man learning his dead mother's language and a woman who buried all of hers, sitting together at midnight, drop the word heard in the comments. I want to know how many of you felt that. And if you're not subscribed yet, now's the time. This is what we do here.
Vance made his move on a Tuesday, which felt almost insultingly ordinary. Alicia had been expecting something. She had been expecting something for days, the way you expected a storm when the pressure dropped and the air went strange and still. She had simply miscalculated the angle of it. She'd been watching for him to move against Elliot. She hadn't considered that he'd move against her first. It was elegant, she had to admit, in the cold, detached part of her mind that assessed threats the way a jeweler assessed stones, dispassionately, purely for structural integrity. She could appreciate the architecture of it. Vance had clearly understood that removing Alicia through force would raise questions he couldn't afford, so he hadn't reached for force, he'd reached for something sharper. Narrative. The file appeared on Elliot's desk Wednesday morning. She learned this from the quality of the silence that greeted her when she arrived at the Golden Lamb. A specific, loaded silence, the kind that meant a room had been talking about you until the moment you walked into it. Two of Elliot's men looked at her with the careful blankness of people following instructions about where to direct their eyes. She understood before anyone said a word. The file, she would later learn, was meticulous. Photographs of her outside the shipping office in Bridgeport, taken on a day she had gone nowhere near Bridgeport, which meant Vance had sourced them from somewhere else entirely and recontextualized them with the patience of a man who had been building this contingency for weeks. Bank records she had never generated, a communication thread in Russian purportedly between herself and Solov's operation, establishing her as the source who had fed Elliot the South Dock location as a test of his response, not as a warning, but as an intelligence-gathering exercise on behalf of the cartel. It reframed everything: her presence in the meetings, her intervention, the midnight conversation at the bar. Every moment she'd spent becoming visible to Elliot Riley had been gathered, reordered, and handed back as evidence of exactly the thing she'd spent 3 years running from, being someone's instrument in a game she hadn't agreed to play. She stood in the corridor outside Elliot's office and breathed through it carefully. Vance had built a very convincing locked room. She just needed to find the door. He was standing when she walked in. That was unusual. Elliot Riley conducted the business of his world from a position of perfect stillness, seated, unhurried, letting the room arrange itself around his gravity. Standing meant something had disrupted the stillness. Standing meant she had disrupted it. The file was open on the desk between them. She didn't look at it. He studied her the way he'd studied her that first night in the private room, reading for the clause that changed everything. Except this time there was something else beneath the assessment, something that looked almost like anger, which surprised her, because anger required investment, and investment required caring about the outcome, and she hadn't allowed herself to believe that Elliot Riley had arrived at caring about her outcome. "Tell me it isn't true," he said, quietly. That was worse than shouting. Alicia looked at him for a long moment. Then she did something she hadn't done in 3 years, something she had promised herself she would never do again in a room that contained powerful men and high stakes and exits she wasn't certain she could reach. She told the truth. All of it. In Russian, the informal register, his mother's language, the one he'd said you couldn't lie in as fluently. She told him about the oligarch she'd worked for in Prague, about the morning she'd understood that the words she was translating were ordering someone's death, and that her voice had been the instrument. About the new name and the 4 cities and the apron and the notebook of vocabulary drills she ran through on quiet Thursday nights to keep the one thing she'd ever been genuinely good at from atrophying completely into nothing. She told him about the South Dock, about Vance's phone calls, about the time code that connected them. She told him that the file on his desk was a beautifully constructed lie built from the bones of a true story, which was the most dangerous kind of lie because it required the truth to dismantle it. She didn't plead, she didn't soften any of it. She laid it out the way she'd once laid out intelligence briefings, cleanly, completely, without editorializing the parts that reflected badly on herself. When she finished, the room was very quiet. Elliot closed the file. "Vance built that in 3 weeks," he said in Russian. "You identified him in 4 days." He let that sit between them like an answer to a question neither of them had asked aloud yet. The gala was held at the Meridian Club, which was neutral ground in the same way a loaded gun on a table was neutral, technically belonging to no one, available to whoever moved first. Alicia wore black. Elliot had sent the dress, which meant someone on his staff knew her measurements, which meant she had never been as invisible at the Golden Lamb as she'd believed she had been. She filed that away and put the dress on anyway. The room was a specific kind of beautiful, high ceilings, candlelight, the kind of orchestrated elegance that existed to make dangerous men feel civilized enough to do business. 200 guests, approximately. She had mapped the exits within 4 minutes of arriving. Old habit. She was grateful for it tonight. Elliot moved through the room the way he always moved, unhurried, gravitational, with Alicia positioned at his side in a role that had no clean title and required no explanation. His men were stationed at intervals she had helped design. Vance was present, which was the point. Vance believed tonight was his night. He had received confirmation through channels Alicia had carefully salted with misinformation over the preceding 72 hours that Elliot would be isolated and his security distracted by a separate incident near the east entrance at 10:15. There was no incident planned near the east entrance. There was nothing near the east entrance at all. She found the first one at 9:40, a man in catering blacks who held his tray with the particular rigid forearm tension of someone managing the weight distribution of something heavier than champagne flutes underneath it. She pressed 2 fingers briefly against Elliot's wrist without breaking her conversational expression. He didn't look at her. He moved them 3 feet to the left, smoothly, mid-sentence. The second was positioned near the north pillar, reading the room in vectors rather than details, the trained eye pattern of someone calculating lines of sight rather than admiring the decor. Another signal, another subtle repositioning. The third she identified by elimination, the one guest in the room whose drink hadn't diminished in 40 minutes. She accounted for all 3 in under 6 minutes. Elliot's men did the rest without disrupting the orchestra. At 10:15, Vance reached for his phone to confirm the strike that was already over. Alicia watched his face recalibrate in real time from across the room. It was, she thought, the most honest she'd ever seen him look. She burned it in the alley behind the Golden Lamb at midnight, which felt appropriately ceremonial without being dramatic about it. The apron went first, then the white shirt, fed into a metal drum the kitchen staff used for broken-down cardboard on slow winter nights. She watched the fabric catch and held her hands out toward the warmth for a moment before stepping back. Nobody had asked her to do it. That was the point. 3 years of careful invisibility reduced to a column of smoke in under 4 minutes. She watched it go without grief, which surprised her slightly. She had expected grief. What she felt instead was the particular lightness of a person who has been holding their breath for so long they'd forgotten breathing had another setting. Elliot found her there. She hadn't told him where she'd be, which meant he'd known anyway, which no longer surprised her the way it once might have. He was carrying 2 glasses and a bottle of the 1994 Burgundy that lived behind the private bar, the one that never appeared on any menu, that she had learned early was reserved for moments the Golden Lamb's owner considered worth marking properly. He set both glasses on the edge of the drum with the easy confidence of a man who had never once in his life worried about the structural integrity of his decisions. Poured without ceremony, handed one to her. They stood in the alley, in the cold, watching the last of the white shirt curl into nothing, and for a while neither of them spoke, which had always been something they were good at together. "You know," Alicia said finally, "it started with a stain." Elliot looked at the fire, then at her. Something in his expression had been different since the interrogation. Not softer, exactly, because softness wasn't a language he was fluent in, more like the careful way a man holds something he's aware could be damaged by carelessness. The stain was Vance's fault. He moved the table configuration that afternoon. I read the report. Alicia looked at him. "You investigated the table configuration? I investigate everything." She laughed then, a real one, unguarded, the kind she hadn't heard from herself in longer than she could accurately remember. Elliot watched it happen with the focused attention he gave to things he intended to understand completely. He raised his glass. "To the stain," he said, in Russian, his mother's register. Alicia raised hers. "To being seen," she answered. The fire burned down to embers. Neither of them moved to leave. Thank you for watching this story of hidden languages, buried lives, and the moment a waitress stopped being invisible. If you enjoyed the twists and turns of this one, please smash that like button. It helps us create more stories exactly like this. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss a beat of our next drama. Drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from. See you in the next one.